I, like many of you, are good at a great number of things, but one of the things that I am terrible at is gardening. I somehow have been gifted with the gift of killing plants. I just don't do it very well, which is why I use perennials such as hostas in my garden. They are great. I don't have to do anything. Somehow on their own, they just die in the winter and rise again in the spring, and I don't have to water them, tend to do them doing anything special with them. They just go. And this is not all such a bad metaphor for our faith. Our faith is kind of like a perennial. All we have to do is plant ourselves in the soil of Jesus, in the soil of the Spirit, rather than working on it, rather than trusting in our flesh, and it just grows. It grows supernatural, outside of our control, and that brings freedom. I am free to enjoy my backyard because these perennials are just doing it on their own. In the same way, we are free to enjoy the freedom of our faith, of life with Jesus, of life in the Spirit, without having to work at our faith. So the one thing I hope you take from this study is that if somehow your faith feels unfree, if you feel weighted or burdened or restricted or confined or exhausted because of your faith, well, that might be a red flag. It might not be, but it might be an invitation for you to seek the Spirit and say, what perhaps might I be relying on the flesh to do? And maybe there's a way that the Spirit can invite us to trust more in Him. And so how do we do that? And I know some of you, even after last week, might say, well, all I've received is abstract concepts of giving myself to Jesus and some invitation to wait. So what is it that we should do in order to lift ourselves of the burden of faith? And so actually what we find in chapter 6 is probably the closest thing to a checklist that you could possibly even get. So if you're the kind of person that was looking for a list of something to do, I invite you to look carefully at Ephesians 6. So starting from the top, verse 1, restore. The invitation here from verse 1 is to say we should restore one another gently. It's completely possible that we have strayed away and that we need to, with one another, bring ourselves back into reliance on Jesus. And you notice that the assumption that's under this, and actually the assumption that's under every single point in here, is that it involves the church. Doing this on your own is an almost impossible task. This chapter is inviting us to utilize one another in order to help ourselves in this process. If you are someone who's feeling burdened or unfree from your faith, the first key point is to find a community of folks which can help restore you back to the life in the Spirit. Number 2, verse 2, support one another. As it says in here, bear one another's burdens. In the example to the Galatians, he's telling them that these Judaizers still need to be restored, but we need to carry this burden with them. We're not just simply going to strike them off or disavow ourselves of these people who are not quite grasping onto the gospel. We need to carry this burden with them and help and support one another through it. Number 3, from verses 3 to 5, and the key point there is that we should test ourselves. You see, at the end of the day, even though we should be carrying one another's burdens, the responsibility is on us to really examine ourselves and say, are we trusting Jesus with every area of our lives? Give ourselves the time to reflect and say, are we actually following God's will in this way or that? Number 4, from verse 6, provide for your teachers. Make sure that you are caring for those who are teaching you the word, because teaching of the word is of utmost importance. Number 5, from verses 7 and 8, is to sow in the Spirit and not in the flesh. And this reap what you sow phrase is just so common in our culture. And if you didn't study Galatians up until now, you would assume that what that means is that you should do good things. But again, catch the meaning. It's not about doing good things. It's about planting yourself in Jesus and allowing Him to transform you. Number 6, from verse 9 and 10, don't give up. It's going to be hard, but continue to strive to do good things and to follow Him even amidst persecution. And that leads us to number 7, which is actually to accept persecution. One of the things that was at the root of the concern of the circumcision group that Paul is speaking against in this book is that the not getting circumcised was actually causing some of the people to be persecuted. And so one of the things that he points out is that the reason they were wanting people to get circumcised was just so that they wouldn't rock the boat. But in verses 11 and 12, he's saying, rock the boat, because to pursue the truth and to do things authentically is going to cause you to be persecuted. Which brings us to number 8, which is to say, Don't boast about whether or not you are doing things well or not well, but only boast in Jesus. We are not to boast about how good of Christians we are. We are only to boast in the fact that Christ has died for us and risen again. And so we are a people that are not about whether we're doing things right or wrong, but that we know a person who has saved us. And finally, step 9, don't argue about practices. As he even points out here, it's not, and he repeats from chapter 5, verse 6, is that it's not about circumcision or uncircumcision. You see, the mistake that the Galatians could make is say, well, Paul is telling us to not get circumcised, so we should make it about that not circumcision, that's the thing we should do as Christians. But Paul's saying it's not even about circumcision or not circumcision. The point is that we need to become a new creation. To argue about whether one practice or not is going to arrive us there is to miss the point entirely. But yes, the application points to this are not entirely obvious. This needs to be done in community and as a process. And so I invite us as a church to take on that call. Let us, as a community, continue to put our faith in Jesus, to restore one another towards that, to know that we're not going to be perfect, but to share in our burdens as we do this, to not be concerned about whether or not it's going to cause persecution or whether it's going to cause fights, but to stay true to this. Let us be a church that is not burdened and restricted by the confines of what to do or not to do, but a church that is set free by a relationship with Jesus.